The wipers of the Honda Civic slapped back and forth with a hypnotic, rhythmic incompetence, smearing the grime of the interstate rather than clearing it. It was the 22nd of November, 1999, and the night had swallowed the world whole. Julian gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his knuckles bleached white against the cracked leather. He was a man of mild temperament and habitual caution, the kind of person who apologized when bumped into and paid his taxes the day he received the forms. He was the innocent, a soul unblemished by true malice, currently navigating the treacherous, winding asphalt of Route 9 through the darkest heart of the state forest. The radio hummed with the dying static of a jazz station that had faded out 10 miles back, leaving only the white noise of the void. Julian reached out to switch it off, but his hand froze. Ahead, suspended in the velvet blackness like a drop of fresh blood, was a traffic light. It hung from a wire that seemed to stretch from nowhere to nowhere, tethered to invisible poles lost in the canopy of ancient pines. There was no intersection. There was no construction crew. There was no crosswalk. Just a solitary, burning red eye staring down at the empty two-lane highway. Odd, Julian whispered, the sound of his own voice startling him in the quiet cabin. Obedience was hardwired into him. Despite the isolation, despite the sheer illogical nature of the signal, Julian slowed. The brake lights painted the wet asphalt behind him in a mirror image of the signal above. The car came to a gentle halt. The engine idled, a low purr that vibrated through the soles of his shoes. He waited. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The woods pressing in on either side of the road were silent. Usually, these forests teemed with the chittering of insects or the rustle of nocturnal predators, but tonight the silence was heavy, physical. It pressed against the glass. Julian tapped the dashboard. "Come on," he muttered. "Turn green." He checked his watch. It was 11:42 at night. He looked back up. The light remained a steadfast, unblinking crimson. A chill, unrelated to the damp November air, began to coil at the base of his spine. It was the primal sensation of being observed, not by an animal, but by something with intent. Julian's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. His breath hitched in his throat. Behind him, emerging from the wall of fog that his taillights couldn't penetrate, were figures. At first, they were shapeless blurs of shadow, but as they moved closer, entering the halo of red light cast by his brakes, they sharpened into focus. There were 6 of them. They wore suits of antiquated cut, charcoal gray and damp with the mist. Their faces were pale, devoid of blood, their expressions slack and waxen. They walked with a synchronized, gliding gait that didn't seem to disturb the gravel on the shoulder of the road. They were carrying a coffin. It was an ornate monstrosity of black oak and silver handles, heavy and glistening with rain. "What on earth?" Julian breathed, his hand instinctively fumbling for the door lock. The clack of the mechanism sounded like a gunshot in the quiet car. He looked forward again, willing the light to change. Green. Turn green, just go. But the light remained red. When he looked back at the mirror, they were closer. They weren't walking on the side of the road anymore. They were walking down the center line, directly behind his bumper. The lead pallbearer on the left, a man with hollowed-out cheeks and eyes that looked like pools of stagnant oil, seemed to be staring directly into the mirror, locking eyes with Julian through the reflection. Julian stomped on the gas pedal. The engine revved, a high-pitched whine of protest, but the car didn't move. The tires spun on the wet pavement, smelling of burnt rubber, but there was no traction. It was as if the car was nailed to the earth. Panic? It rose in Julian's chest like bile. He slammed the gear shift into park and then back into drive. Nothing. He tried reverse. Nothing. The car was dead weight, yet the engine screamed. He looked at the mirror again. They had stopped. They were 10 feet from his trunk. The sudden cessation of their movement was more terrifying than their approach. They stood perfectly still, the heavy coffin resting on their shoulders. They weren't breathing. No vapor rose from their lips in the cold air. Then the sound began. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside his head, or perhaps from the radio speakers that were supposed to be off. It sounded like fingernails dragging across satin. Julian squeezed his eyes shut. This isn't real. You're tired. You've been driving for 6 hours? When he opened his eyes, the red light above was brighter, searing his retinas, and in the mirror, the lid of the coffin was moving. It didn't pop open. It slid. A slow, grinding slide of wood against wood. Julian screamed. A raw, jagged sound. He hammered his fists against the steering wheel. Go! Move! Please! The lid slid further. A darkness deeper than the night spilled out from the interior of the box. From the passenger seat, a voice spoke. It is rude to leave before the eulogy, Julian. Julian whipped his head to the right. The passenger seat was empty. The upholstery was pristine, but the voice had been right beside his ear, wet, guttural, and intimately close. He looked back to the mirror. The lid was halfway off now. A hand reached out from the coffin. It was not a skeletal hand, nor was it the hand of a monster. It was a human hand, pale and trembling. It grasped the edge of the black wood, knuckles straining. Julian grabbed the door handle and yanked. Locked. He pulled the manual lock tab up, but it snapped back down with a force that bruised his fingers. He was trapped in a steel cage, bathed in red light, watching a nightmare unfold in reverse. The figure in the coffin sat up. Julian stopped breathing. The figure was wearing a beige sweater. It had short, sandy brown hair. It wore wire-rimmed glasses that were slightly crooked. The figure in the coffin was Julian. The thing that was Julian in the mirror turned its head slowly, rotating it at an angle that suggested a broken neck. It looked at the real Julian, or the Julian in the driver's seat, with eyes that were entirely white, devoid of iris or pupil. The radio exploded into noise. Not static, but a chant. A low, Gregorian drone that vibrated the windows. Requiem aeternam dona eis domine. The pallbearers began to move again. They didn't walk this time. They surged. In the blink of an eye, they were flanking the car. Julian recoiled, throwing himself toward the center console, away from the driver's side window. A face pressed against the glass. It was the lead pallbearer. Up close, the skin was like parchment, dry and cracking. The eyes were black holes sucking in the red light. The creature raised a finger and tapped on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Open, the creature whispered. The sound didn't come through the glass. It bloomed directly inside Julian's auditory canal. No, Julian sobbed, tears streaming down his face. I didn't do anything. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a good person. Innocence, the voice in the car whispered again, is just a lack of opportunity. The thing that was Julian in the coffin behind the car was standing now. It stepped out of the box with jerky marionette movements. It walked toward the trunk of the Honda. Julian watched in the rearview mirror, paralyzed by a terror so absolute it numbed his extremities. The doppelganger placed a hand on the trunk. The car rocked violently. Suddenly, the red light above turned off. Absolute, crushing darkness enveloped the car. Julian couldn't see his hands. He couldn't see the dashboard. He couldn't see the pallbearers. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Click. The interior dome light of the car flickered on. Julian wasn't alone. Sitting in the back seat, directly behind him, was the lead pallbearer. In the rear-view mirror, Julian saw the creature's face hovering inches from his own neck. The smell of wet earth and formaldehyde filled the small space, choking him. The light. The creature rasped, its breath cold against Julian's nape. Is not for the traffic, Julian. It is for the transition. Julian tried to scream, but his throat had seized. Look forward, the creature commanded. Julian's head turned, compelled by a force he couldn't resist. The headlights of his car flickered on, cutting through the darkness. They illuminated the road ahead. But it wasn't a road anymore. 20 yards in front of the car, the asphalt ended abruptly. Beyond the jagged edge was a twisted guardrail and a steep, devastating drop into a ravine. And wrapped around the trunk of a massive oak tree at the bottom of that ravine, crushed into a shape of unrecognizable steel and glass, was a beige Honda Civic. Julian stared at the wreck. He saw the license plate. It was his. He saw the arm hanging out of the shattered driver's side window. The sleeve of the beige sweater was soaked in blood. "No," Julian whispered. The denial was weak, crumbling like ash. "I'm driving. I'm right here." "You have been stopped at the light for 3 hours, Julian," the pallbearer whispered. "It is time to turn green." The radio cut out. The silence returned. Julian looked down at his own hands gripping the steering wheel. They were becoming translucent. He could see the leather texture of the wheel through his thumbs. He looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The coffin was open. It was empty. It was waiting. The pallbearer in the back seat leaned forward, his dead, dry lips brushing Julian's ear. "Get in." The car door clicked unlocked. Julian felt the will to fight drain out of him, replaced by a heavy, narcotic lethargy. The fear evaporated, leaving only a vast, cold sorrow. He understood now why the light never changed. He understood why the road was empty. He wasn't the driver. He was the cargo. Julian opened the door. The cold November air didn't bite. He couldn't feel temperature anymore. He stepped out onto the road. The 6 pallbearers were waiting for him, forming a gauntlet leading back to the open coffin. They didn't look scary anymore. They looked patient. Julian walked past the rear bumper of his spectral car. He walked toward the black oak box. As he approached, he saw that the interior was lined with satin the color of a bruise. He climbed in. It was a tight fit. He lay back, folding his hands over his chest. He looked up at the sky. The fog had cleared, revealing a starless void. Above him, the traffic light buzzed. Click! It turned green. The lid slid shut, sealing him in darkness. Then he felt the lurch of being lifted, the rhythmic sway of the march, and the slow, steady journey into the long night.